Hi, Ali Reza. Thank you
Yep.
for joining. Thank you for joining
Hi there,
us
Donna.
today at this X Future Friday interview. And Ali Reza is the founder of ThroughPut AI. I want to briefly introduce you, and then give you the opportunity to do yourself even better justice. But essentially, Ali Reza has started ThroughPut AI, I think like maybe 6 years ago or something like that. And has been rapidly growing this groundbreaking business. Essentially, what they're doing is they're using artificial intelligence to optimize upstream and downstream supply chain operation. And essentially, they're helping companies leveraging their data and make better supply chain decisions. And we all know the value of having data, and now we want to learn today what this means in the supply chain world and for companies that are dealing with high volumes of demand and also having to generate that supply, much coveted supply. So Ali Reza, can you introduce yourself to us real quickly?
Yeah, thank you, Donna, and thanks for having us on X Future Fridays podcast, video cast in this case, right? My name is Ali Raza. I'm the founder and CEO of ThroughPut. As you correctly mentioned, ThroughPut puts supply chains on autopilot. This is a big problem, right? We're trying to help operations on a daily basis do a better job fulfilling customer demand without being totally stressed out. How this company started was I am an operations person who started as an operator and made my way up to running 2 countries as a geo market manager. And the challenges we always had was around, well, how do we be more efficient and how do we do things better every day, right? And in the industries that I worked, they weren't very data driven at the time. The problem that I discovered at the time was, when in industries that are very boom and bust, one of the biggest, get out of jail moves that managers make is they lay off people, right? Because that quickly cuts the cost and allows you to survive. What I realized was looking at the P&L sheet, I was looking at cost lines, and I was realizing that there was more money tied up in logistics and inventory costs. So it made me really question that, hey, when there's millions of dollars tied up in these costs, why don't we start cutting orders and stop overproducing rather than go after people, right? So that pretty much became the foundations of what is ThroughPut today, and that's what keeps us going on a daily basis for the last several years.
And I think, what's really relevant to your story is also your background, your education. You essentially have multiple degrees in chemical, biomolecular engineering, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnology. So to me, this seems that you really know this inside out. You know the materials, you know the problem with the materials. You've applied AI to the problem, and then you've also had the experience to be really spent, I think, maybe 4 years in the industry on the service providing side. So yeah, tell us a little bit about how your background helped you in this endeavor.
Yeah, in hindsight, you really start connecting the dots and seeing where it all plays together, right? So like you said, I went to school for chemical engineering. Chemical engineering, well, it gets very deep into all sorts of things like nanotech, semiconductor, and pharmaceutics, right? Ultimately, it's all about material flow, right? Energy balancing and looking at how momentum is changing, all stuff that physicists look at. You don't really see the applications until you get into the real world in terms of industry, right? But it gives you that mindset of thinking of problems from a holistic perspective. So I had the incredible fortune to be a chemical engineer, teach it as a graduate student, and ultimately make my way into an industrial setting where we're not really doing incredible problems in terms of mathematics perspective, but you're actually applying it in terms of flow rates and trying to understand how to get stuff from, say, the port of Dubai off the coast to like some border of international waters of Iran or Qatar, right? So that's when you start really applying and seeing the problems firsthand, and you start making the connections in terms of, okay, there's a model that I used to make in college, right, in terms of how things flow, and here's all the exceptions to the rule in terms of why it doesn't work. So I think that really helped lay the groundwork of understanding operations, being able to understand how to simulate them and actually build models. And that ultimately led to the opportunity to start a company like ThroughPut, which took a few iterations, but ultimately it hits you when you can actually combine your academic background and see how it can be applied to model the physical world. Oh, you might be on mute there.
Thank you. So I think now is a good time to start diving in. We're just kind of like scratching the surface now. And so let me start by asking you, why ThroughPut? And then that's an open-ended question for you.
Yeah, so I think entrepreneurs and the company itself asks that question every day. I think for me, right, it's been a continuation of the whole process engineering process, right? When we identified the problem in 2015, we wanted to help companies, help their operations people improve on a daily basis, right? And do it more efficiently and more effectively, because nobody likes to work 3 days straight and sleep 9 hours, right? I've done that off the coast of Dubai on a ship. And so what I realized was that there's an incredible opportunity to use data to make processes a little bit more efficient and more effective, which can allow for less stress on people, especially in really intensive industries where you're clocking 13 miles per day just running around a well site, or you're going up and down the manufacturing floor moving really heavy equipment, right? Or oil and gas where you're picking up pipes that are 50 pounds or heavier. So that's where I started seeing the opportunity, right? So the why was very simple for me, which was, okay, when we need to improve our P&L sheets, right? When we have to show more profitability, the easy way out is to lay off people, but you do not see the consequences in terms of mental health and what that might mean for someone's career, or what might that mean for someone's family. On the other side, there's this huge elephant in the room, which is inventory sitting in warehouses that are going to expire, logistics costs because of inefficiencies. And my real question was, well, why does this exist, right? Why don't we go after the big problem in the operations rather than the little problem, right? Which is ultimately, laying off people, bringing them back, laying off people. It just destroys culture. So that sort of became the foundation of how do we solve this problem, right? And ultimately, it led us to the inefficiencies in supply chain and how to make it more effective. So what we did is we took a more problem-centric approach, right? Rather than saying, okay, what are all the technologies out there, AI, IoT, big data, to improve operations? We took it the other way, right? Which is, this is the line that gets affected, and this has the most long-term impacts on the human culture. And how do we look at a different cost line on the operations, or a different part of the balance sheet, and say, hey, we're going to attack this, and we're going to make sure there's continuity in the workforce, which companies like Toyota have done for many, many decades, right? In Japan, where people are so happily employed, and they've figured out how to make the supply chain so effective that they don't have to push the button on layoffs and getting rid of people. So that's really the why of ThroughPut, right? In a nutshell.
So there's a lot of reasons, but one reason is providing that safe environment, even for employees, that you don't have to worry that tomorrow you're out of supply that you really need for an order, or you're stuck with too much and now you need to cut savings somehow. And that impacts a lot of factors in the company. Interesting. So let's, with this note, dive a little bit deeper into the problem, right? Because I'm sure that it's kind of like multi-layered. There's a lot to unpack there. So let's talk about really the problem that you're solving and what your customers are experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on top of that, right? So the question becomes, okay, well, how do people prevent a situation like that from happening to them, right? Is you have to basically put your operation in perspective that you're not the person who is at fault, right? And the way I would do it in operations, and I'm as guilty as anyone else, was I would order 10x of what I needed, right? And my back and forth with my managers was like, well, either this can sit in the warehouse or it can sit on the operations side. Where do you want zero downtime, at the warehouse or at the operations, right? And no manager is going to say, okay, you know what, bring it back, and we want zero downtime on the site, right? So I think the general challenge, right, because of this is operations to pretty much cover and de-risk their chance of being responsible for downtime. They end up either over-ordering raw materials, right? And they overproduce, right? Saying, hey, either there's two things: either the customer is going to be unhappy or my manager is going to be unhappy, and it's better to have my manager unhappy than my customer unhappy. Now, what this does is overproduction is in charge of 40%. It's responsible for 40% of the waste in the world, right? Toyota kind of came up with that number many years ago with their Kaizen and their lean principles. And what I realized was that the reason why this happens, right, is people do not trust the demand forecast, right? We saw last year in COVID, everything's all over the place, right? Plastics is all over the place, food is all over the place. And the way operations buffers for this is they just make more or they order more, right? But ultimately the problem is this impacts the balance sheet, this impacts the P&L, where free cash flow is jeopardized. And now a business might be running in the red because of those decisions, right? And now you have to lay off the worker. So it's a perpetual cycle, right? Where demand forecasts are never going to be accurate, no matter how much AI and data you throw at it, except for some commodity markets where you can actually predict what's going to happen. And operations is always not going to know what's going to happen in terms of demand. So they're always going to overstock. So there's a huge opportunity to leverage the historical data to give more confidence to operations, to build further trust with the planning principles, to say, hey, you don't need to have this much buffer in place. 99.9% of the time, you're not going to need it, right? And we effectively need to, we instead of preparing companies for all scenarios, right, in terms of, well, what if COVID happens? What if we go through a drought? We've figured out that you should only prepare them for two scenarios, right? Either capture more market share when you have a competitive advantage, or figure out how to operate profitably to weather the storm, right? And that's what we do.
Okay. So I think, yeah, let's dive into what you do and how you do it. And if you can speak broadly about it, or if you want, you can choose some kind of a, customer case study that you have in mind to talk more about the solution, how you solve this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So, supply chain problems exist anywhere things are made or moved, right? So if you think of the global economy, right, World Economic Forum calls it a $90 trillion global economy, right? If you add up all the GDPs of the world, there's a lot of problems to solve where you're over-ordering, overstocking, overproducing, overspending. The way we solve it is initially we come in and say that, look, right now you're making certain products, right? Last year you made, say, 50 million bottles. This year you're making 55 million. Next year you're going to make 60 million, right? The first thing we question is, why do you want to make that many bottles, right? Some things are very arbitrary, which is people fundamentally think that if we make more, then we're going to sell more, right? We flip it on its head and we say, well, what are you guys actually selling, right? Let's look at what you're actually selling with your sales data, with your purchase data, and work backwards to make what sells, right? And what we're able to show to customers is you can actually make, 10 million bottles less, and you can make the same impact on your bottom line, right? And have less engine hours running, which helps emissions, helps sustainability. And ultimately, by having a better product mix and putting the right products at the right place at the right time, which an AI engine can easily tell you based off of the historical data, what works at a global level across multiple factories, it's a more effective way, right, to make more, have less of a carbon footprint, and ultimately have a better outcome financially in terms of net impact. So that's essentially what we do. We come in, our AI system picks up on the data, figures out what's selling, looks across the entire supply chain, figures out where the product needs to be at what time, how much buffer stock you need, and it optimizes the entire end-to-end supply chain.
So tell me a little bit more about this. I think this was a aha moment, right? When you came in, you were looking to optimize, the supply chain, and then also forecast demand, right? But you had this aha moment around we need to find out what is selling. It's not necessarily that we want to now spread out and figure out the demand for all the products, but kind of like do an overview, a 360 overview of what this factory is doing, what is working, what is not working. And so you had this layer of realization that wasn't there before with the data that you were able to collect, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important to find your space in any market, right? So supply chain and manufacturing optimization has been going on for the last 150 years, right? This goes back to Taylor, Ford, Ono, Goldratt, you name the person who came up with the biggest breakthrough in the space, right? So what we realized was that even when I was running my district was one of 13, right? Or my geo market was one of 15, right? So what ends up happening is we optimize from a siloed perspective, saying we're going to focus on our data and we're going to make sure our operation runs the best, right? But ultimately, the reflection on the balance sheet can be not there ultimately, because what ends up happening is if you're just moving inventory from this location to that location. And if you're running at a loss in this location and making money on this location, you're just balancing out all your efforts, right? So our aha moment was that you're never going to compete with consulting, right? Because there are lean consultants that come in and optimize factory by factory to make things more effective on the production line. And there is SAP that operates in terms of looking at purchase orders, right, which is coming in and out. The aha moment was that if you can provide a more global optimization across multiple factories and multiple machines and multiple people and so forth, here's an opportunity to layer on top, right? Pull the data that is not only tied to the purchase orders, which is what's coming in and out, but add this layer that's currently missing, which is the manufacturing layer in terms of what is being changed, right? These ERP systems are not strong in handling material change across the end-to-end supply chain. So there's a huge gap that needs to be filled. And then secondly, the ability to buffer and look at it from an inventory replenishment perspective, right? So there's a huge part of the industry today that is make to order, right? Which is, hey, once we get something from the customers, that's when we start ordering stuff. And so many ERP systems can deal with that. Then there's the opposite end of the system, which is make to stock, where, say something like ice cream, right? You start making a lot of inventory of ice cream. So when the summer months come in, that's when you draw down. That's the opportunity that needed to be plugged. And someone had to do it from an end-to-end perspective. And that was really the true aha moment we had at about a couple of years ago, in fact, that this is how, here's an opportunity to service something that needs to be done, right? Because it's responsible for so much waste in the world.
So what would be an example, for a customer, for a type of product that you're really helping optimize its supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think of agriculture and food-related companies, right, they are very weather pattern-oriented businesses, even building materials for that matter, right? So they have to do a very good job understanding temperature, they're understanding, weather patterns in terms of rain, right? Leveraging a lot of historical data to understand when the ramp up is going to start and when the ramp up is, or when you're going to run into a glut, or the market's not going to be as hot anymore. In one case, where we're working with a plastics manufacturer that supplies to agriculture companies, right? They are very seasonal, right? Where they have to look into what's going on with the weather, what's going on in terms of needing more chemicals, right? We have been able to show them that you can actually operate less, make to stock, and more to order, and ultimately eliminate warehouses, right? This is really important because you don't have to order as much raw materials early on, and you don't have to put too much raw materials in front of perennial bottlenecks, right? One of the things we explain to our customers is your machine is not going to make more than it can take in, right? This is a huge concept, seems very fundamental, but if your machine can only absorb, say, 50 kilograms an hour, and you have 500 kilograms sitting in front of it, it's just not going to adopt it, right? So using the data, you can optimize it not only at a production level, but across factories, right? And this is huge in terms of reducing how much work in progress inventory you have. And in some cases, we've actually tripled the inventory turnover, right? So this is huge opportunities just by looking at it from a flow perspective, what can be done from a sustainability perspective, from an economic perspective, and from a overall, ESG perspective as well.
Got it. Okay, so I want to understand, how do you implement the product, right? Like, what does it kind of, if you can give us a better understanding in real life, what does a POC look like? How do you gain the trust of your customers? How quickly can you show them value, and how does it happen?
Yeah, so I think credibility is very important in the supply chain space. It's still a very early market for AI, right? So typically the people who end up making decisions are CFOs, COOs, people who have kind of worked their way from the production line up to a geo-market level, right? An executive level where they understand how operations works from an end-to-end perspective. And they understand that at the end of the day, they're responsible for a P&L that is tied to the earnings per share of the company, right? So you need to have leaders in the organization that have either solved those sorts of problems or have worked their way up to that location. We're fortunate to have several leaders within ThroughPut that have that background, right? Where they were on the floor and they managed P&Ls and so on and so forth. So that's the trust element, right? Which is the ability to go in and say, I've done this in this setting before, right? This is being the typical challenge of many IT-centric startups, right? Which is they come in and say, we have this awesome AI product and it's going to improve throughput by 2x, right? The number one question that always comes back is, where have you done this before? Or do you know our business, right? Do you know what it takes to make popsicles, right? Do you know what it takes to make engine blocks or whatever it is, right? And if the answer is no, then you lose a lot of trust, right? Because they're like, well, then we don't want to be the guinea pig here, right? The second thing is the investment from a resource and time and dollars perspective from the customer, right? What ends up happening is the way IT projects are mapped out is they have a certain cadence, right? Where they define the problem, they set up the IT resources, they have a 12 to 24 month rollout. Well, if you're in operations, you live day to day, right? You live quarter to quarter, and you're judged by how much output you're making or how much more margin you're adding to the business, right? So that just doesn't work. So we had to short circuit the entire POC process, right? Which is how to go to operations and the CFO and say, look, what do you want? Ultimately, you want better net impact on your bottom line, correct? So I have a tool that if you can give me a sample of your sales data and your operations data, I can come back with a model and show you where we can cut today in front of bottlenecks, right? And recoup a lot of the value. And from there, make a case to the CFO and the CIO that now we can go through that entire roadmap of actually becoming a digital transformation, right? This is kind of the biggest challenge I see CIOs and IT innovation groups face in the industry today, where they're given a small budget and they're told that go solve the problem, right? You're a cost center. If you look at almost all IT organizations, they're still looked in industrial companies as cost centers. We come in and say, if you have data, the historical data is enough to prove and free up cash today. You don't have to wait for 3 years later when digital transformation is done. And so that's our process, right? We come in, our pilots have been as fast as 24 hours. It's been down to 30 minutes. In some cases where we got the data, it was, uploaded into the system. The AI basically said, hey, this is where the product should be at this time of the year, right? And this is how you can be more efficient. And the next, when you get there, then you get that meeting with the CFO and the CIO because you used their data to prove opportunity, right? That's the key. Even if you have tangible or you have cases that are what do you call it, complementary or in another part of their supply chain, until you don't do it for them, it isn't the aha moment for them to say, hey, there is an opportunity here. Just because our competitor found $4 million of savings doesn't mean that we're going to find $4 million of savings. But the minute you take your data and say, hey, I can add $5 million per location, that gets you a conversation with the board and the CFO.
And do you ever have, I assume you do, challenges around the data? If companies are not willing to share the data or if they just don't have the data, what happens then?
Yeah, absolutely. The bigger corporation you go with, right, the more concerns they have around data security. Data security is a huge problem right now with the whole SolarWinds Act and everything. I've gone through, I think, 20 to 25 page certification or just checklists saying that we have this, we have this, we have this, we have this, right? And naturally, as a startup, you can't answer all of those questions, right? And say, look, we're a startup, we don't have XYZ, right? That's what AWS provides. So we literally leverage a lot of our partner network to provide us the data security that is required, right, for our systems. So we are sort of tied to certain cloud providers that ensure our security and other providers, right? So we're very concerned about data security in terms of getting the data and treating it. Now, what's nice is with supply chains, right, it can be anonymized, right? So I don't know if I'm working with cookies or shampoos or razor blades, or I'm working with chemicals, right? Because I can just be looking at a material code, and that can allow me to make the analysis, give it back to them and say, look, item 7562470 has this opportunity in terms of reducing waste and improving turnover, right? And so we have a very interesting way to make the data blind and have the conversation until the customer is more open to sharing more, right? It's a process, right? It's about building trust with the customer and delivering value and getting them to the point that, look, it is more valuable to leverage this data to actually add more value to your business from a net impact perspective than to keep it internally, right? If there's a huge concern, we can do it on premise, right? Which is, we'll come in, it costs a little bit more, we can do it within your four walls, right? We can install a license into your system and leave it there and provide maintenance support, of course, that is a lot more expensive, right, from our perspective. But the way they see it with cloud and compute, the variable cost is basically what impacts their overall selection of products as well, right? So it's kind of still a balancing act between the cloud-based AI providers and the customers that are buying it, right? They're trying to still evaluate whether cloud really is cheaper in the long run, right? It was cheaper for storage, but when you have all this AI compute, it starts adding up, right? So it really depends on what you're solving and whether it's worth spending so much on cloud bills.
So let's think one step further. Once the customer is onboarded and becomes a full customer, do they use your software as a SaaS, and do they use it independently? Do they become proficient in using the software, or is it a mix? Do you have like an account manager that works with them? And also, do they need analysts and data analysts to work with the software?
Yeah, what I've tend to find is with bigger corporations that make, say, $5-10 billion more in revenue, they have incredible professionals that can look at a dashboard and act upon it, right? VPs of purchasing, VPs of logistics, they can look at it from a daily perspective and see how the demand is changing. And VPs of productions who are very data savvy can say, okay, I can put this product at this machine and I'm going to look for the next 2 weeks what's going to happen, right? So we find the bigger the company, the more resources they have to just implement it themselves. Smaller companies sometimes have it's a cultural change, right? Using AI to run an operation is very unheard of in this business. But typically what we do have is we've established a network of incredible change consultants who are ex-professors, Bain, McKinsey, A.T. Kearney guys and gals that ultimately can take what they're seeing and say, look, I've been in your business before. I understand what the system is telling me to do. And if you would like us to handhold and help you, guide you through this process, we can make it happen, right? So what's important to understand is different businesses and different companies are at different stages of their AI adoption and how much they trust the AI, right? And in some cases, some businesses are very bold, which they'll look at it and say, okay, I'm going to make the cut myself, and we're going to see what's going to happen, right? And in some cases, they're very conservative, right? Think of businesses that have been doing things for centuries the same way, right? It's a very hard sell initially to say, hey, I'm going to do something so transformative in this business that hasn't been done for the last 500 years, right? And so it becomes an art of using the AI to say, this is what can be possible, and a change consultant sometimes to make it happen, or a very bold or very visionary internal leader who thinks that, yes, if we even have a little bit of success in this factory and we prove it, then if we scale it, then this is how it can transform our business. So it's a mixed bag, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit about how does ThroughPut stand out in that landscape in terms of competition? If there's any other competitors, what are the biggest ones in the market?
Yeah, so I mean, number one is being there in the operations, right? We've seen a lot of the problems, right? And we know what the current solutions are to it. And typically they tend to be manual, right? Someone looks at the data and says, okay, we're going to do this internally from a production perspective for one factory, right? So as long as you're in the four walls operations, it's hard to tell someone who's been doing something for 20 years that you can do it better, right? It's a very hard sell. But when you start looking at it from a multi-factory perspective and go end to end, that's where you have a little bit more advantage, because what we've seen is interface is always bad, right? That's where nobody wants to take handover responsibilities, right? So if you think of distribution centers, a distribution manager will be running a distribution center for 20 years, right? A certain way, and he knows every shelf like the back of his hand, right? He can sense when a shelf is about to be refilled and when it's going to be empty, right? And then on the manufacturing side, there's people who've been running the same machine for the last 30 years. They can actually sense the pulse of the machine, right? I got to the point when I was at my last job that I could actually look at the pumps, and just based off of how the trend line was moving, I could tell that it was going to go down or fail about a minute or 2 minutes before it would happen. So we didn't need the AI at the point, right? The trouble is always on the interface, right? Because the logistics managers are responsible for moving stuff. the warehouse guys and gals do their thing, the manufacturing gals and guys do their thing. It's the middle point where people are like, well, it's not our jurisdiction, right? That's where we see a lot of the inventory pile up. So that's the big opportunity that we see going end to end in terms of optimization. The second part is also being able to handle material changes, right? What we see in the market is there's a lot of supply chain software, supply chain visibility, end-to-end supply chain. But when it comes to manufacturing, they will not touch it because the data today that comes from SAP and Oracle is around purchase order data, right? And that's basically not looking at often, well, bill of materials in terms of how things are changing, right? Which is how did this plastic turn into, say, a car part, right? That's where all the opportunity is. That today is being serviced by consultants, right? Saying, okay, because nobody wants to actually go into the factory and get into the chemistry or the actual production operations, right? We'll come in and solve that problem. What we figured out is there's this huge inventory opportunity to manage that part of the equation if you can build the manufacturing piece into the supply chain piece. That's what we did in our Ellie platform, right? It can handle the supply chain and manufacturing on the same platform. It can handle inventory replenishment, buffer management, and it can handle the material change, right? And this is where we differ from a lot of the robotics process automation, business process automation softwares, where they're looking at it at a global level and they're fixing the processes at the top, which has immense value, don't get me wrong, right? But the furthest they get down here is for opportunities where they're essentially making to order, right? Where the purchase order coming into a location is the same as the input of the MES, right? So there's no discrepancy. If there are buffers, it's either swept under the rug or that's basically where all the cash is tied up, right? So that's the opportunity that we're going after that I believe more people will go after as well, but it's going to need three sorts of expertise. Operations, knowing how operations works. IT, which is handling that data discrepancy between the supply chain and the manufacturing systems, and finance, right? Which is, can you communicate to the CFO that a short-term solution is better than a long-term 3 to 4 year rollout of a product that will not be able to handle, say, multi-echelon inventory optimization because it can't. The data doesn't exist today to do it with the systems that they're tied into.
Got it. Well, thank you for this. I'm wondering if you want to share with us any kind of like success stories, metrics, like a customer that you have in mind that you were able to significantly improve their operations, numbers-wise, time-wise, anything like that you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have multiple customers and we tend to work a lot in commodities, right? So steel, glass, plastic, building materials. What we've typically seen is we have delivered anywhere from a 2 to 50x ROI off of our pilots, right? And that's huge. The beauty of us going end to end is there's incredible inefficiencies that are not captured in these interfaces that I was talking about, right? Between distribution and manufacturing and finished goods and retail, right? Typically, when you go at, as I mentioned, everyone's trying to optimize for their four walls, and they're sort of ignoring this interface problem where all the cash is being tied up. So in manufacturing, we've actually tripled inventory turnover, right? In building materials, what we've done is we have shown that there's, even if they eliminate 10% of what we're showing in terms of excess working capital, it already pays for the enterprise license, right? In food logistics, right? We have shown how upgrading certain machines is just due because the cost of those machines being down now exceeds just getting a new machine and just shutting it down for a couple of months and having a new machine up, right? So we are very inefficient in terms of manufacturing and supply chain across the US, across the world, except for some countries, right, that have their act together. And so there is a huge opportunity. And it even doesn't come down to countries, right? It comes down to company cultures, right? Places like Japan, which are heralded as the birthplace of Kaizen. Well, there's some companies that have adopted it, right? They're super supply chain manufacturing excellence companies, but not all Japanese companies are that efficient, right? I would say 90% of them are not the Toyotas of the world, right? There's this, or same with the German companies, right? They look at efficiencies and so forth from an end-to-end supply chain perspective. Well, we see it's not as advertised, right? So it really comes down to companies, company cultures, what they want to do in terms of efficiencies, and of course, our bottom line is, how does this impact the operator, not only from a professional level, but a personal level, right? Which is, how do we keep them in jobs longer, get them cross-trained into other things? This pretty much frees up the capital to keep investing back in people to grow the business, right? Because ultimately that's where most of the ROI comes from.
Thank you. You very casually touched on so many important topics. I have to kind of, like highlight it. We touched on environmental sustainability. We talked about company cultures and how companies, treat and retain their employees. And so you really are, touching so many important causes with what you do. Let's go over to our final question for today. So that one is a little bit personal, and it's about you. We want to know what inspires you, what motivates you, what or who.
Yeah, some people I think are just geared a certain way, right? So what I like about supply chains, it's pretty much the fundamental pipes of how the world works, right? So if you're very curious in terms of the fluid mechanics of the world, right, this is basically how to get involved in it. I guess what inspires the team in general, right, is we have an incredible group of backers who are executives from notable companies, right? Like people who are at large automotive companies, large food companies, an incredible group of investors that continue to introduce us to people like yourself, for example, to keep the mission going, right? Ultimately, if you take it back to day one, it just comes back to the layoff problem, right? Supply chain is just the way we're solving it, right? That's how we're addressing it, saying that if this is efficient, we can actually deal with the variance, so we don't have these incredible impacts to furloughing people and laying off people. But I think that's basically what keeps the team going every day, right? We have an incredible group of advisors that pretty much were the giants of this industry and still are, right? So I really believe in the concept that Goldratt came up with many years ago, which he calls standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Which is, there's a lot of great work that has been done in our space, right? In supply chain, in manufacturing. The next generation, our job is to say, okay, based off of the technologies and the know-how we have now and what we've learned in the past, how do we keep contributing to that ecosystem, right? And supply chain is truly a global problem we're solving, right? So I think there's enough problems to solve. That's what makes it interesting. Over the last 4 to 5 years, we've been fortunate to touch something like 20 different industries. So we've learned a lot in terms of how the world works, right? Like, I had no idea how canals worked before we started ThroughPut. Right? I had no idea how railroads worked, right? I had a certain perspective, right, which came from chemicals, being an operations supervisor, hardware, right, in oil and gas, for example. Or back when I was in pharmaceuticals, it was that, right, which is how do we move vaccines, how do biologicals work, how do we market it? With supply chains, when you start seeing that the raw materials are pretty much the same for all industries and just tracking it all the way to what they ultimately become, that's where you see what everyone is working towards. So we're all part of the supply chain now. And I think that's pretty much enough inspiration to keep going on a daily basis.
Definitely
right?
One of the more inspiring and inspired entrepreneurs that I've met. And I was fortunate enough to meet you in person. And I do hope that, we'll see more of you and the growth of ThroughPut at the X Future. I really appreciate your time today, Ali Raza. I know that you have a very, very busy schedule, and the fact that we were able to do this and have a very interesting conversation. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks to the entire X Future team for hosting us this Friday. And have a great 4th of July weekend, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.